Hello and welcome to What Makes a Difference. And we've been going just over a year now.
Mm. I mean, when was our anniversary?
That'd be last episode with Mark.
Did I miss it?
No, you were there with Mark.
Yeah.
Yeah, 1 year.
1 year. Who knew?
We did indeed.
So your fault, Rich. You bagged me.
Definitely.
Mm-hmm. So, what are we talking about today?
We're going to chat about how difficult it is to get engagement from veterans into certain organisations or charities to partake in activities.
Yeah, I think there's quite a mixed response, isn't there? And
there is, yeah. Obviously, not everything's going to appeal to everybody, but I know of at least one organisation that's closed down simply because people didn't attend it, and it's probably one of the best charities going at that time.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, you've
got
really...
but because they couldn't get any engagement, even though one of the guys who's employed by one of the local largest employers employs a lot of veterans there, nobody was interested.
Yeah, it's almost like there's this kind of double bind that providers find themselves in. Because you'd put up a post about that engagement on LinkedIn, and we were having a debate over what we thought the cause of that was, because it does have an impact then on the services, and there's an awful lot of frustration where there's a lot of people who are doing a huge amount of good work but don't seem to have the consistency in terms of buy-in or engagement to keep it going. Yet when the service is removed, there's an awful lot of outcry about that.
Yeah. So I wonder if in some cases it's people have gone away to do various courses on whatever program it is, and they've told their mates about it and going, well, that's a load of rubbish. And so that then informs somebody else who might be interested in going on. Well, I'm not going on it because my friend, in fact, didn't find any use out of it, even though that other person might do.
We do say that the best form of advertising and marketing is recommendation.
And I think along the lines of, for every one bad review, then that affects 10 other people.
Well, yeah, I think I remember when I worked in customer service, what they basically talked about was that if you have a good experience, you're likely to tell maybe one or two people. If you have a bad experience, you're likely to tell 10. It's almost like we take the good for granted and then shout out loudly about the bad.
And that's possibly what has happened with these courses or programs. They've been taken for granted because they're there and people expect them to be there.
That has a knock-on impact, though, not only on the provision, but the extent or scope of the provision. In other words, how many flavours are out there?
Mm-hmm. There do seem to be quite a few people doing very similar things.
Yeah, I would agree with that.
And what is it? There's over something like 3,000 charities or non-profits that are there to support that veteran and military community.
Yeah.
And I wonder how much overlap there is and how little collaboration there is. So how much does one group say, no, you can't go off anywhere else. I'm looking after this person. You can't help them out. You can't work with them. I wonder how much that's going on. But when we've had those chats with other people, with different organisations, they're on about, we want to collaborate. We need to collaborate because that's how the scene is now changing.
There's definitely an increase in the desire for cross group working, for collaboration. Now, interestingly, that's being driven, I think, by the funding that's available out there just now. So there is less and less of the small pockets of funding. So that means you have to have the capacity to go for and apply for the bigger grants. That means that for smaller organisations, they're kind of out of the running unless they are working in partnership.
or startups.
Or startups, But there's another issue with that. And that's sometimes the way those funds and those grants are structured. They can be very prescriptive. Because as you were saying earlier about that person said maybe it's because somebody said that doesn't work, so therefore it's rubbish. If you look at the provision for support, the one thing that's true is not everything works for everyone.
Absolutely, yeah.
And that sometimes the biggest challenge is finding what works for you. And it might not be the first, second, or third. It might take a while before you go, actually, this really does it. This is exactly what I was looking for.
And how much of that is also a case of pride at stake? I don't need that help because of this. So in other words, is because I've served and I've done this and that, and I've got that mindset of everything's honky-dory, or may not be honky-dory, but I'm just about coping. So I do not need anybody to come in and interfere with what's going on in my life because I can sort it all out myself, even though they may be struggling to keep up with whatever it is they're, let's say, bills for argument's sake, dealing with that.
I think that's
finding a decent job instead of job hopping and going from one thing to another to the next.
I think that's so true for a lot of us, that sometimes the hardest recognition or the thing that you can say is, I'm not coping. Because in that situation, you already have that sense of overwhelm and that final thing of saying, I'm not coping, for a lot of people, it's almost like that last thread they're hanging on to in terms of how they feel about themselves, and they don't want to have that conversation. Yeah, at the same point, it's a really important one to have.
Yeah.
But if
does that go along with not wanting to be a victim?
Yeah, and I think it's also to do with how we want to be seen, how we want to be. Is that old adage, isn't it? If you fake it till you make it. But I don't know that does many people very many favours.
No. Oh, that's possibly holding people back as well, isn't it?
I think it holds people in places they don't necessarily want to be in. It's just they don't know how to say, I don't want to be in this place. I don't want to be in this job. I don't want to be in this financial situation. I don't want to be in this emotional situation.
Well, that goes to levels, environment, and all that, doesn't it? So if my environment isn't particularly good, anything else above that is very difficult to change. So if that person's job hopping and everything else, and they're ashamed of where they are, so I don't know, say for argument's sake, somebody left as a senior officer, non-commissioned officer or something along those lines, but now they're ending up on go to the job centre, claiming benefits and all that kind of stuff. Then there may be a lot of pride in going, well, I'm not sure of how, I'm embarrassed about where I am and a shame attached with that because I was up here, but now my status is right down here. And I'm not living in the house I want to be living in, but rather I'm living in a less than good place. So if they can't change that environment, they're ashamed of where they are and embarrassed about their situation. That's a difficult thing for some people maybe to get their heads around. Is that changing status?
It's a bit like not wanting to be the first one to admit that it's all shit right now. But the minute you do, everybody else goes, oh God, I'm so glad you said that because me too. But who wants to go first?
Yeah.
Because there's always that fear that if you go first, will I be the only one? And if I'm the only one, will I then be judged?
Yeah.
When, for all you know, you're standing in a crowd of 20 people just like you.
Yeah. There was a QM and he was saying he went away on a course, and he had a load of questions to ask, but because nobody else wanted to ask any questions, he didn't bother. Because again, he's going to feel stupid for asking questions.
I also have almost the opposite experience, but with the same outcome, in that I used to always feel quite embarrassed about how many questions I asked.
Mm-hmm.
I do ask a lot of questions, I know I do. But I remember somebody that I worked with, we had an opportunity to give each other feedback, and she said, "I wish you would ask questions sooner." And I'm like, "Yeah, what?" That was the last thing I expected her to say. I was like, "Pardon?" She's like, "Sometimes I get frustrated because you'll spend most of a meeting, and then you'll wait until maybe the last 15, 20 minutes, and you'll ask the question. And if you'd asked that question sooner, we'd have been out there half an hour earlier. But it's almost like you put it off."
Mm-hmm.
But I was doing that because I was conscious that maybe people thought I was asking too many questions. For that person, their feedback was actually no. So I was walking about with these whole thought sets of assumptions about judgments, about things about how people were reacting. But it wasn't actually true.
No.
And that's that same situation where there's that point of, how do I tell somebody that I need support? Because sometimes in that situation, you feel like you're the only one. You never are.
Mm-hmm. Oh, definitely. Well, the provision of charities out there and organisations shows that there is a need for them. But again, it's getting that interaction, it's getting all that involvement from that community to take part in these activities.
There's a risk there, though, with that lack of involvement, and the risk with the lack of involvement is it actually starts to narrow the range of options that are available. Because you and I were talking about this earlier. It's about, if we, again, and I'm going to go back to the funding landscape for all of these organisations. The majority of funding applications come with terms and conditions. They come with things that you have to be able to do, provide, work within. That means that they drive organisations down the same channels, because they all have to be able to provide very similar offerings if they're going to be able to apply for the grants. So that means that you end up with 20 variations of the same thing, 100 variations of the same thing. Because there becomes, because of the lack of uptake, there becomes less variation.
Yeah, bland.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, when in actual fact,
well, essentially, it'd be like going to a restaurant, and all you're going to get is a variation of tomato soup. That restaurant's not stay open very often or for very long. And that's all that's on the menu.
Yeah. It's almost like these things have to be used, they have to be trialed. You have to be open to the options that it might not necessarily be a standard approach that works for you. The irony is you and I both work with people who have gone through, you could class as the standard offerings, that hasn't worked for them, because they don't work for everyone. Nothing has 100% success rate.
I'd say if you're looking around about, say, 60%, 65%, doing really well.
Yeah. And some of the more traditional approaches, they're really starting to question whether or not actually these are effective. But the NHS models are still constrained by the rules and how swift they can actually change and adapt. Now, there's reasons for that.
Well, that's all the nice guidelines, isn't it? So it's measurable.
It has to be measurable. There have to be the statistics, the analysis, the data.
Which is fair enough, because ultimately there's the bean counters going, well, if this isn't sustainable, it's not funded, or it's not statistically working, then we're not going to fund it anymore.
It makes sense. Why would they if you can't prove it works?
Yeah.
But that also means, though, that funding has to be available to trial the new, to trial the different, to go, actually, let's give it a go and see what happens, so that there is the variation. That if that doesn't work for you, there's still something else for you to try.
Yeah. Well, that's why they're re-examining, isn't it, CBT and EMDR?
Yeah. Because while they work for some things, they don't work for everything. And EMDR is not a guaranteed response. I think there's something like there's 7 out of 10 that it works for, but there's a good 3 or 4 out of 10 that just won't engage with EMDR. It just won't make any difference whatsoever. And that's how your brain processes information. It's how you process information. You've got to find a match for that.
Well, and that also depends on the therapist as well, isn't it?
Very much.
Yeah. So as I was listening to a podcast, I can't remember the name of the chap who runs it now, he was chatting to somebody who said, I know some really bad hypnotherapists, but the results they get are really good because it's all about that rapport and how they get on with their client.
But I would argue that he's using the wrong measure for good or bad then, because it's the outcome.
I think it's, So I think it was how this person does their inductions and things like that, rather than the actual person itself. Yeah. It's not a measure of their results, it's a measure of like how they did their inductions and all that sort of stuff, rather than.
I like to think that in a lot of ways, that's maybe sometimes the power of moving outside of the more structured provision, maybe like the NHS or the bigger organisations, is you've got more freedom of
choice.
And choice. I mean, you've always got freedom of choice, but generally the choice is engage or disengage, do or don't do. But you've almost got more scope sometimes with the smaller providers to look at the actually, am I a good match personality wise? Are you a good match for me? Do you get how my head works? Do I get where you're coming from when I'm working with you? Do I feel comfortable with you? Do I feel relaxed? Or am I just sitting here thinking, well, that was all they offered? If I don't do this, then I'm stuffed.
And I wonder how much of it, with the lack of engagement, is everything has to be free at the point of entry. So people go away on a weekend course, or they go away and have a workshop somewhere. They go, oh, thank you very much. But because it's free, there's no value in it.
Well, the irony is I've certainly had that feedback from veterans I've worked with where they've said to me, I trust you because maybe this is something that I'm doing on a pro bono basis. I trust you because you're not charging me, because it's not about the money for you. And while that's true to a certain extent, the irony also is then the reverse of that, where you hear people say, well, it was free, so it couldn't have been that good. You can't win.
Yeah.
Because there's no such thing as something for free. It costs something, whether that's an individual's time, their expertise. There is a gift of a giving there.
Well, they wouldn't expect like a plumber or a solicitor to give their time or advice for free, would they? A plumber may come around and get a free quote. You may get a free half-hour consultation with a solicitor. But when it comes to actually doing the work, they got a choice of going, all right, I'll do it myself. Or they actually ask a professional to help them with that situation they're with.
You wouldn't ask that, nor would you ever go to a haircut and expect to have it for free.
No, but some people do go, oh, I don't like that, or you've cut that wrong, and they do walk out without paying.
I'm not paying that, no.
Yeah.
But that's about the service delivery. That's, unless you're kind of eating and running. I suppose there's a dilemma there, though, isn't there, about how you attribute value, and is maybe part of the uptake and the engagement down to lack of recognition of value.
Could well be. Because again, people don't go and see that. Say plumbers have to go away and get updates on courses of how to install the latest boiler. They don't have to go away and see how they got to re-register for, say, gas safe, update, anything like that sort of stuff. Same with electricians. I guess the same with solicitors. People don't see how much the course is that we go and cost.
Well, they don't, and they don't stop and think about all of the residual costs, the residual expenses that these organisations have just to be able to open their doors and function.
Yeah.
That they function a huge amount on goodwill, from the people that volunteer, that support them. But those volunteers in turn, their hours that they give have a value. They might not get paid for them, but there is a value attributed to it because of their experience, their skills, their investment to get that. Yet if you have people that just don't turn up for that, and well, there's a whole host of reasons. If that's because, well, I didn't think it was worth anything, it couldn't have been very good because there's no cost to me, then I would say reevaluate that.
Yeah, or turn up and donate.
Turn up, try it out, donate, yeah.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
And then on the reverse, well, not on the reverse of this, but where that conversation goes about how much these large organisations have in the pot.
Well, that's a complex one.
Mm.
I think a lot of that is sometimes down to, it's very easy to look at an organisation and go, well, I looked at your books and you've got very large reserves and you're not doing anything with that. But the bigger an organisation gets, the more of a reserve finance, the more in the bank they have to have in order for their accountant every year to say you're still viable.
Yes.
Because they can't generate money, they've got to go for funding and grants.
Yeah, or by the Charities Commission.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So the Charities Commission demands to know that you're sustainable for the next year.
Yeah. And then,
that means,
not I'm justifying it, the people who run the charities then get a hefty payout as well. They get a good old salary for it.
Yeah, I'll give you that. There are some very high salaries paid at very, very high levels, and sometimes they are. I would raise an eyebrow. However, there's also that middle point where you've got to recognise that these sometimes are incredibly big, complex jobs. These are massive jobs with a huge amount of responsibility that goes with them. And there's an element of what is that worth?
Mm-hmm.
Because the majority of the people that work within the charity or not-for-profit sector, we don't do it to get rich. Sure as hell don't do it to get rich. It's notoriously a sector that isn't well provided for in terms of pay, salary, terms and conditions, that sort of stuff.
Especially for frontline staff.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, especially for that. And
some of the things they have to put up with as well.
Well, I think that comes back to our point, isn't it? Is think about that. Take that into consideration before you attribute value. Because just because there's not a cost to you doesn't mean to say that there isn't a value attached to it, and that value could be a hell of a lot more than you actually think. But it's also about engagement, isn't it? To keep the range of options available, because that's really important.
Yeah, otherwise, as we mentioned earlier, it'll go down that same old bland route of that same the tomato sauce with a slight twist in it.
Yeah, you'll only ever have tomato as the flavour and nothing else. Yeah. Mm-hmm. And much as though I do like a good tomato soup, there is a limit to how often I want to have that. Yeah.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. There has to be variation.
It does.
But I think there also has to be more collaboration.
That's very much needed.
Mm-hmm.
So what are your takeaways then, Ali?
That because the funding landscape is getting more challenging, there's a risk that we're going to lose the scope and breadth of options that are available for people if there's not the support and the uptake and the recognition of the value of this, of how important that is. What about you, Rich?
It may not cost you anything, apart from time, but it is costing that provider, it is costing that volunteer at the end of the line or wherever it is, quite a bit of their own time, maybe quite a bit of their own resources to get there.
Mm-hmm.
So take that into consideration.
Value it.
Mm.
Yeah.
And if you're not valuing it, donate. So then you may feel like you're getting something out of it afterwards.
Mm. Yeah. Well, the other thing is if something's not working for you,
Give someone else a go.
Mm-hmm. Because there will be something out there. There is still a lot of variation, but that variation needs to be supported.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And if you like this podcast and our chats, please do like, share, and subscribe.
And if there's anything you would like to talk to us about that we've maybe brought up or to work with us,
yeah, you can always drop us an email and they'll be in the show notes or they're above us on the YouTube channel.
Is this where we should go? This is right here. Uh-huh.
That's it.
Yeah.
Until next time. Thanks for listening.
Thank you.